Hi, today I'll be reviewing AP World Unit 8 Part 2, Decolonization. This video is meant to inform and educate, and I do not want to cause any incidents regarding biases or anything like that, as it's just meant as a review for test we're having. It's not meant to cause any political or ethnic tensions. I guess that's all I could say. So let's get started. So 8.4, Spread of Communism After 1900. So the first place that we're going to see is China. So after a 20-year civil war in China, the Chinese Communist Party won, with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces fleeing to modern-day Taiwan. And so after this, Chairman Mao of the Chinese Communist Party decided to work on social policies, such as nationalization of Chinese industries and creating 5-year plans. One of these was the Great Leap Forward, which was basically land reform with having farmers and suburban workers in communes in order to support massive industrialization projects, my bad. And all who have protested these were killed or sent to re-education camps. And this project was pretty much a failure and was abandoned by 1960. Another project by Mao was the Cultural Revolution, which basically was like an attempt to invigorate China's commitment to communism. And basically, it silenced critics and opposition to Mao's plans by using students who were extremely radical and caused a lot of tension in the country. Along with that, the Chinese relations with the USSR was not too good, with them being hostile to each other and having many border skirmishes. So these propaganda pictures shown above, the bottom one is just a picture of the Great Leap Forward, and sorry, not the Long March, and the book that's shown over here and above in the propaganda picture is Mao's Red Book, which was used as like a stepping stone for the Cultural Revolution and was extremely important in Chinese communist literature. So Iran. So basically during World War II, the Iranian leader considered supporting Hitler's regime, and both England and the USSR did not want that to happen, so they invaded Iran and took control. They also told the Iranian leader to abdicate power to his younger son, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and they kept their forces in Iran till the end of the war. And Iranian nationalists objected to this Shah as a puppet of Western powers, and they forced him to flee the country. But then the United States and Great Britain also engineered a plan to overthrow the new country, and they brought back the Shah. So the Shah, he tried to do some good things, but he was not that great of a person. And some of his reforms was the white revolution, with land reform, social welfare, with free education, women's rights, and a medical corps. And the land reform worked for a few, but then was not fully successful, and his policies alienated many people. And due to that, the Shah fell in 1979, creating a theocratic government, which is basically a government where religion is the supreme authority. And the new government was headed by a cleric in the Guardian Council, and the cleric was basically the Ayatollah of Iran. And yeah, and basically it became like like it's not like too good of a place nowadays. And like these pictures show Iran before and after the revolution, and Iran nowadays is frankly not that good of a place for women's rights. And yeah, Latin America. So Latin America also had lots of land reform, and some examples of this was Venezuela, where the government redistributed 5 million acres of land. So some of this was partially seized from landowners, but some of it was also state-owned. And this was pretty recent from 2001. And another one is Guatemala, which basically there was a democratic government who was under the charge of Jacob Arbenez in the and basically what happened is they started to do some land reform but then a company called the United Fruit Company lobbied the United States government to remove Arbenez, and in 1954 he was overthrown. So spread of communism after 1900. So in Vietnam, basically North Vietnam was an agricultural society and a few people controlled most of the land. And so communists vowed to seize this land from large landowners and redistribute it among the peasants. And this pledge won them great support among the peasant class. But when communists took power in the north, they carried out their policies, but then they did it violently. But in South Vietnam, the government was slow to do such things and it was unpopular. Ethiopia. So we have two leaders, Haile Selassie, who basically was aligning the country with the Western powers after the war, and Ethiopia enjoyed economic success based on its coffee trade. And along with that, they had Western style reforms. However, by the 1960s, the country was souring, and many people saw him as a pawn of American imperialism. And that led to a coup led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, an Ethiopian native and major in the military. He ordered the assassination of 60 former regime officials, and the new government declared itself socialist and received aid and weapons from the Soviet Union and other communist countries. However, famine and other economic policies that failed and rebellion marred his leadership, and by 1991 he had resigned and fled to Zimbabwe. India. So India also had land reform, and one state in India which had such reforms was Kerala. So in Kerala, they had like 4 times where they had opportunities for land reforms, such as in 1960, 1963, 1969, and 1974. However, despite the popularity of the program, the Indian government took direct rule of Kerala in order to slow down or reverse the program. So the Indian central government or the federal government was not happy with the policies. So 8.5, decolonization after 1900. So the first thing we're going to see is India and Pakistan. So this one is one of those extremely hot topics with tensions still there today, and I don't want to stoke any tensions in the comment section, and I hope that we can be peaceful about this. So basically, the drive for Indian self-rule began in the 19th century with the foundation of the Indian National Congress, and most Indians wanted India to remain the same and to not separate. However, the Muslim League, founded in 1906, advocated for a separate nation for Indian Muslims. However, along with that, not all Indian leaders agreed with Gandhi's nonviolent non-cooperation movement, along with his calls for unity between Muslims and Hindus, but they put their differences aside until World War II is done, and then they demanded independence. So after World War II, Britain was basically growing weaker and weaker, and they had to give away their territories back, and they had to basically allow the former colonies to self-rule due to not having enough money. So basically, what they did is they decided to separate India into 2 areas. However, this was botched with a lot of issues made with the new countries being formed, Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. Well, Bangladesh was actually East Pakistan, and it separated in 1971 from Pakistan. And it just caused a lot of problems with, like, it's a whole nother story. Like, it's a lot of things to go over, but what happened was that basically, I'm trying to paraphrase. What you had was so the border wasn't announced until 2 days after independence from of India and Pakistan. And what that caused was due to the tensions, people had to leave wherever they were, and it was basically a mass exodus of Hindus from Pakistan to India, or Muslims in India to Pakistan, and that just caused issues. And that's shown over here in this picture, with many people fleeing from, I'm not sure if this is India or Pakistan, but then they're fleeing to get to wherever they need to go. And it was one of the largest exoduses in history. Along with that, you have decolonization in Ghana, where basically ideas of modern nation states influence nationalism. And you have this guy named Kwame Nkrumah, who took office in 1960. And he basically constructed a national narrative that centered on having a historical past of glory and rich tradition, founding fathers, a currency, a flag, an anthem, museums, and monuments. And he also created numerous public works and development projects, such as hydroelectric plants. And the thing is that by 1964, he claimed dictatorial powers when the voters of it agreed to a one-party state with him as a party leader. So he basically was the ruler of Ghana. And one of his ideas was Pan-Africanism, or basically having all the people in, well, how do I explain this? Basically having the culture of all the nations in Africa together, and rejecting intervention from former colonial powers. And he did make it work with an Organization of African Unity, which was founded in 1963. But 3 years later, his government was overthrown, and there would not be a peaceful transfer of civilian power from one elected president to another until 2000. So it became very dangerous over there. So Algeria was a French colony, and they basically wanted independence, and they had a war for independence against the French in 1954. However, many French people were on the side of the Algerians, and Algeria considered and France basically allowed Algeria to separate. And Vietnam, the last one. So basically, what happened in Vietnam was that you had a guy named Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist leader of North Vietnam, and he appealed to nationalist feelings to unite the country under a single communist government. However, France responded by attempting to reestablish its colonial rule, which then sparked the War of Independence that lasted until 1954. And however, what happened after was that Vietnam was split into two parts, with the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And they both got into war in 1964, which is now known by many Americans and people around the world as the Vietnam War, which I believe you know what happened with that. He failed horribly, and North Vietnam took over the whole country. So the Suez Crisis. So basically what you had is that after World War II, Egypt became one of the 6 founding members of the Arab League, which grew to 22 member states. In 1952, a general named Gamal Abdel Nasser, along with another person, Mohammed Naguib, overthrew the king and established the Republic of Egypt. Naguib became his first president, Nasser its second. And he was a great proponent of Pan-Arabism, which is similar to Pan-Africanism. And basically his domestic policies blended Islam and socialism, and he instituted land reform, transforming private farms into socialist cooperatives that would maintain the existing irrigation drainage systems and share profits from crops. He nationalized some industries and businesses, including foreign-owned banks, and taking them over and running them as state enterprises. However, he started an international crisis when he decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal was built by Egyptian laborers who died. Well, thousands of them died while working on the project. And France had the lease for the Suez Canal for 99 years. But when Egypt took over, Israel, Britain, and France invaded Egypt, and basically they what they did was they caused an international incident which had both the United States and the USSR opposing their actions. And this was a major loss for the West, with many other countries thinking that the West was going to invade as colonialists and causing tensions. 8.6 Newly independent states. So Israel basically, what happened with Israel was, so after World War II, what happened was that Zionists, who are people who wanted a separate state for Jewish people, they argued that Jews could be free from persecution in a place where they have their own place to be. Like, sorry if I can't explain it that well. And what happened was that after World War II, many European Jews who were left after the Holocaust went to this place called Israel and basically created a new country from there. And what happened was, after that, many countries tried to attack Israel and invade it, which caused a lot of issues. And some of the wars were the Suez Crisis in 1956, which you just talked about, the Six-Day War, where Israel basically steamrolled over Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, and Yom Kippur War, which was in a way a repulsion of an invasion by Egypt and Syria. And after this, what happened was the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, which basically was a peace agreement which was orchestrated by the United States President Jimmy Carter. However, some people, some organizations, such as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, wanted the return of occupied lands and the creation of an independent country known as Palestine. However, violence in the area, such as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, is still going on today, and it'll probably be continuing for a while. Cambodia. So Cambodia was basically turned back into a monarchy after the end of World War II. However, Cambodia was drawn into the Vietnam War, and after that, a communist guerrilla organization called the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, overthrew the right-wing government of Cambodia. And once they were in power, they imposed a rootless form of communism, which was following the Chinese model of cultural revolution, which targeted intellectuals and dissenters. The slaughter and famine that followed took more than 2 million lives, around a quarter of the country's population, and there were mass graves of victims from the killing fields of California. Sorry, not California. I can't speak today. My bad. Of Cambodia continue to be discovered, and many of these killing fields are still discovered today, and the death toll was horrendous. And these pictures just show the humanity of it, with a child soldier having a human skull on the tip of his gun, and a woman crying over a dead person. Now you have India and Pakistan, and basically what happened with this is, after India and Pakistan become separate countries, there's one place where basically there was an issue with who rules it. And the thing is, with Pakistani and Indian distrust, they don't trust each other at all. There's hatred between both sides still, and that's still ongoing today. And one persistent tension was over Kashmir, which is a border region in the mountainous north. So at the time of the partition, most people in Kashmir were Muslims, but its leader was a Hindu. Therefore, both Pakistan and India claimed Kashmir. And at times, the rivalry broke out into armed conflict, and the tension became extremely significant after each side began developing nuclear weaponry. And now, basically, India controls 45% of Kashmir, Pakistan controls 35%, and China controls around 20%. And while talking about conflict between the two nations, one incident that occurred was a shoot down of an Indian MiG-21 in 2019 due to airstrikes from India against Pakistan. Well, not Pakistan. I'm not sure if they were sanctioned by the Pakistani government, but terrorists who were stationed in Pakistan, and this led to an Pakistani F-16s being scrambled into the air and shooting down MiG-21. And this picture over here is the Indian-controlled region of Kashmir with Indian troops watching the area. So 8.7, now we're almost done. Woo. So 8.7, global resistance to established power structures. So nonviolent resistance as a path to change. So there were many protests against colonial rule and for civil rights also. And some of the main leaders who went for nonviolent resistance was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. And all three of these people were using nonviolence in their later years, and in order to get their people free or to get civil rights. So let's talk about MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. So his civil rights movement used various tactics in order to achieve its goals. So one example was court decisions such as Brown v. Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, which basically banned racial segregation of schools in the United States. A year-long boycott of public buses in Montgomery, Alabama, which ended segregation in public transit. Massive marches, such as the 250,000 people march on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And many of these efforts provide the foundation for the movement's biggest successes, which is such as the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which is covered more in Unit 9. And lastly, we have Nelson Mandela. So basically, in South Africa, the white minority government codified a system of racial segregation called apartheid into law in the 20th century. And so the resistance movement for that was a lawyer named Nelson Mandela. And although in his early life, he supported sabotage and other forms of violence, he was known for leading nonviolent protests. And more of this is covered in topic 9.5. So now we also have challenges to Soviet power. So basically in Poland, so you had workers that demonstrated against Soviet domination and demanded better living conditions. And as a result of this, a new secretary of the Polish Communist Party, sorry if I mess up the name, Władysław Gomulka, came into power. And he decided to pursue an independent domestic policy in Poland, but continue to be loyal to the Soviet Union, allowing the continued presence of Soviet troops in Poland. And the Soviet Union established forced collectivization of farms, and this ended around this time in 1956. Hungary. So at this time in Hungary, protesters convinced the country's political leader to declare Hungary's freedom from Soviet control and demand the withdrawal of Soviet troops from the country. And the political leader, Imre Nagy, vowed to support free elections in which non-communist parties would participate, and he announced Hungary's neutrality in the Cold War and the withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. However, Soviet leaders responded by invading Hungary, gaining control of Budapest, and executing Nagy. Along with this, many Hungarians fled to the West as refugees. And in 1968, you have Czechoslovakia with the Prague Spring. And basically, you have Alexander Dobek, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party, acceded to the demands of the Czech people by increasing freedom of speech in the press and allowing greater freedom to travel. He also agreed to make the political system more democratic. And as with Hungary, Soviet leaders feared the Prague Springs independence, and basically the Warsaw Pact countries crushed that rebellion. And in 1968, the Soviet Union used the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was named after Leonid Brezhnev, to justify its actions. And basically, this is a picture from the Prague Spring, I believe, of a Russian tank being burnt down while protesters are moving together. And 1968 was kind of like a 2020. It sucked as a year. There were many protests, and some examples of these are in Yugoslavia, where students marched against the authoritarian government. Poland, Northern Ireland, people protested over religious issues. Brazil, marchers demanded improvements in public education and fair treatment of workers. And Japan, where students protested financial policies and government support for the US in Vietnam. Along with that, you have France, where basically you have hundreds of thousands of students marching into the street in order to call for reforms, and with that basically it led to violence, and there were 10 million French workers that went on strike, and it was one of the largest strikes in French history. Along with that, you had the United States, and in the United States you had students and others who demonstrated for rights for women and African Americans. And along with that, some of the largest protests, however, were in order to stop the Vietnam War. And after members of the Ohio National Guard killed 4 unarmed students during an anti-war demonstration, students and faculty at hundreds of colleges and universities went on strike. And this picture is of Earthrise, which is taken in the end of 1968, December. And it basically was like the stepping stone for the US environmental groups and many others in the world. Sorry, I can't speak that well. Forming. And this picture just shows the Earth vast in the vast darkness of space being just a small ball, while there's pretty much nothing else. And like it just shows how small Earth is compared to Earth and humanity is compared to the rest of the whole universe. It's really an impressive and like meaningful photo. So last one. So, well, second to last actually. So terrorism. So basically terrorism started to open up a lot more in the post-Cold War period. And so one of these groups was in Northern Ireland called the IRA, which basically wanted to leave the United Kingdom because of discrimination and different religions. And this is just like, it's extremely blunt, and there's a lot more underlying issues with it. And the people in Ireland started like a rebel group called the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, and many people joined them in order to fight against the British occupation. Along with that, you have separatists in Spain who want to have independence from the Basque region in northern Spain, and their actions led to more than 800 people being killed and injuring many others. And basically the separatist group, the ETA, declared an end to its violent actions and promised to work within the political system to achieve Basque independence. Along with that, you have Islamic terrorism, which basically started like from a while back. And one of the major groups was Al-Qaeda, which was financed by Saudi billionaire Osama bin Laden. And they carried out terrorist attacks in many countries, including one in the United States in September 11th, 2001, my bad, sorry. And this incident killed 3,000 people in the United States. And along with that, you have ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq, Lebanon, the Levant in the Middle East, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And most of these victims of these terrorist attacks were Muslims, and Some high-profile attacks occurred in European cities such as Madrid, London, and Paris. And yeah, I guess that's it. And lastly, on a final note, so the last thing that's in for 8.7 is the military-industrial complex. So in 1961, the US President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a highly decorated general in World War II, called this combination of government defense departments and private businesses supplying their demands in the military, called it the military-industrial complex. And some of these countries are Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and Oshkosh Defense, and like all these companies that have a large amount of funding for projects. And just these two pictures over here just show like the true scale of the military industrial complex. This picture over here is the F-35 Lightning, which the program for creating this aircraft cost more than $1 trillion, probably around 1.5 trillion. And it basically still hasn't reached full service yet. And although making things like this is new technology is expensive, but then is it worth the cost? Such an airplane like this, because it doesn't even have the capabilities of other aircraft, such as the F-22. And another one is the Zumwalt class destroyer, which doesn't even have any working armament. And even though it's supposed to be the latest destroyer, it costs a lot. I'm not sure about. I believe just one ship of its class is 3 billion, and due to it not having any working armament, it's basically not able to do anything. And along with that, you have the US defense budget with being at least $800 billion, which is basically around Cold War levels. But why do we need that? What are we doing with all that money? For example, we've gone out of Afghanistan. There's not much issues left to do so. The only possible threat is the rise of China, which I'm not sure if that could be considered too much of a threat because we already have the stuff we need. We may have to modernize a bit more, but then, yeah, like what's the point of $800 billion in the military? So I guess that's pretty much it. So thank you. I hope you learned something from this. And sorry if my speaking wasn't too good. I just can't speak right now. So yeah, thank you and stay safe.